Two college students, Adam and Wiley, are introduced as the episode starts at Pretty Lake. Wiley, who is only 19, is expecting a child but does not want to publicly identify the father. Later on, she'll join her father and sister at the church where they both serve. They hear a scream and rush to see what happened, only to discover that their father has collapsed on the floor, blood splattered across his face. The girls can't wrap their heads around how their father, who seemed perfectly well, could have died this way. Another day of deaths from massive blood vomiting. After this, the scene jumps ahead 4 days to when around 50 individuals had perished since the occurrences began. As a result of the shocking fatalities, the ministers in Pretty Lake have decided to institute a quarantine as quickly as possible out of fear that the sickness could have spread farther. In the meantime, Adam pays his scientist uncle a visit in the morgue. Currently, he is attempting to determine the source of the epidemic by analyzing blood samples from local residents who have perished. In spite of many hours spent looking, I have been unable to find anything definitive. As though there were nothing out of the ordinary about how these folks passed away. Adam goes home and tries to persuade his mom that they need to go out of the city right away since he's scared. However, before she can speak, blood begins to spurt from her mouth, and she, too, meets a horrible end. Military personnel then erect an electric fence around the whole perimeter of the city. Next, the Creeker brothers, the show's secondary characters, are presented to us. Ronnie, the younger brother, is a drug dealer who frequently gets into fights, whereas Pat, the older brother, is responsible and hardworking. Creeker brothers decide to have some fun a few days later, while the city continues to spiral out of control due to the quick fatalities and the stringent quarantine. They steal one of Charles, the city's wealthiest residents, costly pickup vehicles after breaking into his auto showroom. The astute businessman, however, spots them via CCTV and chooses to handle the situation himself. He and Chuck, his similarly conceited son, track the Creeker brothers and trap them in a remote area. Then Charles pulls out a gun and demands that they undress. Gord, a good Samaritan, shows up with a gun and compels Charles to release the brothers so that he may go on to his next evil plot. Adam, being a brilliant student, hacks onto the government website and discovers that no one under the age of 22 has died from the mysterious illness. He hurries to tell his uncle the shocking news, but upon arriving at the morgue, he discovers his uncle lying lifeless on the floor. When he eventually runs across his closest friend Wiley, he warns her that they'd be smart to get out of town quickly since something strange is happening. Wiley decides to go and she immediately begins packing. Sadly, her water bursts a few hours later, rendering her immobile. This prompts her to send Adam a text explaining why she'll be unable to attend. When Melissa sees her sister Wiley in agonizing pain, she attempts to shout for help, but in the commotion outside, no one answers. This prompts her to quickly seek assistance from the previous Good Samaritan, Gord, who also happens to be a close friend. The pair then goes to Wiley to help her deliver a newborn boy. However, Adam makes it to the city limits with a fence cutter in hand. The officers in the army, unfortunately, catch sight of him and begin firing. Adam takes a blow, but his bulletproof vest protects him from serious injury. Despite waiting for 4 days, there has been no change. No new information has emerged that might help the government determine the origin of the disease. Melissa begins caring for the orphans at the church following the deaths of all adults. When the virus begins to slow down, the government eventually declares that the quarantine will be lifted. The young people of the city will have to collect the bodies and burn them if they want to do this. In response to the encouraging news, the survivors have begun moving the corpses of the deceased to a predetermined location. Meanwhile, after the passing of his haughty father, Charles, Chuck has emerged as a de facto leader. He's attempting to keep the city's youngsters under control so they don't cause trouble. Lana, his missing sister, has been gone for a few days and he is doing everything he can to find her. Once he and his boys witness the violent drug dealer Ronnie Creeker take drugs from a residence. Chuck tries to assert authority and urges Ronnie to back down, but Ronnie is unmoved. As an alternative, he pulls out a gun and threatens to shoot the lads if they don't get out of the way. Chuck has no other option except to release him. But when one of Chuck's friends shows him a picture of a lady whose middle finger has been severed, Chuck loses it and starts screaming at his friend. After realizing that she must be the owner of the same house from where Ronnie took the drugs, he concludes that Ronnie targeted her for the ring. Consequently, he rounds up the crew and makes a beeline towards Ronnie's house to exact his vengeance. We then witness Wiley storming into the home of the man who is likely the father of her child and rummaging over inside. Presently, a young man approaches her, brandishing a blade. Wiley says she is going to go because she is scared, but he stops her and convinces her to stay with him instead. He goes so far as to unlock a safe and retrieve an envelope addressed to her. Unfortunately, Wiley starts to feel dizzy and passes out before he can give it to her. While tending to his property, Gord spots a group of vultures swarming around a carcass in the adjacent woods. After some exploration, he discovers the body of Chuck's sister, Lana, lying near a tree. She's holding a handgun and has a cut on her head. Without delay, he contacts Chuck and Adam on the spot. Based on what he sees, the latter concludes that she died as a result of a fight. A footprint next to the deceased is also photographed, and the crime scene is documented in detail. Chuck reluctantly takes up his sister's body and carries it to the backyard, where he burns it. Later that day, Chuck's autistic sister Amanda tries to make dinner at the family's local supermarket by frying chicken patties and chopping up potatoes. As far as she's concerned, Lana, the little girl's sister, is already back at their house. Due to her carelessness, however, the oil ignites and sets fire to a significant area of the shop. Amanda escaped unscathed, but she is reluctant to admit she was to blame. That's why she tells her brother that an old vehicle came into the store when he asks what happened. When he hears this, Chuck immediately suspects the Creaker brothers since they, too, drive an old pickup. In the evening, the entire town congregates around the corpse pile and plans to burn them. Adam, meantime, is trying to track down a man he met through a government website and who he thinks may know anything about the odd illness. Fortunately, he is able to track down the man and steal something from him. Then, just as he's about to depart, he hears a cough. Closer inspection reveals to Adam's astonishment the presence of Wiley among the corpses. Before the entire pile can be completely consumed by flames, he rushes up to her and lifts her to safety. On the other hand, a tiger attacks a little child who has gone to the zoo to feed him, and then breaks out of his enclosure. Upon discovering Lana's phone the next morning, Chuck immediately contacts Gord. He insists they should face the Creaker brothers head-on in order to discipline them. At first, Gord is hesitant to join Chuck since he says they can't simply randomly attack people. However, after learning that Ronnie was the last person to message Lana, Gord changes his mind and decides to help Chuck. Gord asks his younger sister, Frances, to feed and water the cows before he leaves the farm. Following this, Chuck, Gord, and their pals amass outside of Ronnie Creaker's house late at night and demand that he come out. Pat, the older brother, is concerned, so he instructs Ronnie to hide out in the basement until he can take care of it. Afterward, he leaves the house to have a conversation with Gord and Chuck. Chuck is convinced that the Creaker brothers are attempting to trap him since the power suddenly goes out throughout the entire town. This leads him to shoot at Pat, provoking a counterattack from Ronnie, who is hiding in the basement. When things get out of hand, Chuck and his team decide to pull back, but Gord is shot in the process. A while later, Chuck pulls up to a drugstore and dumps off Gord. The second gives him confidence that he is okay and can take care of himself. Although Gord enters the shop after Chuck has left, he collapses on the floor from blood loss. Luckily, Melissa, one of his friends, comes by to help him up. Moreover, she tends to his wound and sews it shut. Concurrently, Pat is informed by Tracy, the second Creaker sibling, that Ronnie has left the house. She adds that she examined his phone and saw that he had been sending texts to both Lana and another female. While Chuck's girlfriend Stacy sleeps at home, Ronnie sneaks in. It's clear that these two have been friends for a very long time and care deeply about one another. Since Ronnie keeps pleading for assistance and insisting that he is innocent of Lana's murder, Stacy has decided to give in to his requests. Next morning, she brings him to see Chuck in an effort to smooth things up between the two of them. She almost succeeds in protecting Ronnie, but at the last second she betrays him by telling Chuck she was attacked. Chuck and his gang of thugs chase after Ronnie, who has angered them, planning to beat him up. Frances, Gord's sister, is attempting to power up the farm by starting the generator. To make matters worse, the released tiger catches up to her just as she reaches the attic. She eventually emerges from concealment while toting a firearm. The tiger sees her and moves in for the kill, but she is able to get off a couple rounds in time to kill it. Other than that, Adam and Wiley use the power outage to their advantage and leave the city, where just a few soldiers are stationed to protect the electric gate. She looks at her child one more time before she leaves him in Melissa's care. When they finally get to the boundary, they use a cutter to effectively rip it open. As they pass the gate, they are shocked to see that the entire region is littered with landmines. Adam tosses Wiley's bag onto the ground to make sure, and a big explosion occurs, just as they had predicted. A lot of money has been dispersed and the bag is a total wreck. When Adam inquires as to the source of Wiley's wealth, Wiley stubbornly declines to divulge. The two go back to their city having failed in their effort. When Chuck and the gang track down Ronnie, he is taking Amanda captive somewhere else. Fearing the consequences of her actions, the small girl confesses that she put the grocery on fire. Simultaneously, Ronnie admits to Chuck that he did not kill Lana and begs for a gun in exchange for Amanda's protection. Because he has no other choice, he gives him a firearm and helps him rescue his sister. Before Ronnie can react, Chuck launches an attack, punching him many times in the face. Gord and Pat just so happen to walk in and keep them apart. Once the truth about Ronnie's whereabouts with Chuck's girlfriend Stacy is out, they can finally go on to discussing Lana's murder. The conflict has barely begun, Ronnie says as he walks away. Gord then goes to his property and is scared upon discovering a tiger's body in the front yard. Upon entering, he promptly starts looking for Frances. In a few moments, he tracks her down and compliments her on her bravery, saying that their parents would be proud of her. When Wiley gets back, though, Melissa shouts at her for abandoning the kid and leaving without telling her. After this, Wiley storms out of the house in a huff, but not before telling her sister that she is no longer responsible for the care of their little son. Sometime later, as Wiley is aimlessly exploring the city, she runs across Ronnie. He invites her to visit him at his apartment, and Wiley, to his shock, accepts. After dropping off her son with Tracy, she and her husband go hunting the next day. Aside from Harrison and his pal, two other young people in town enter into Chuck's auto warehouse and steal a pricey black vehicle. The heist is witnessed by Chuck's boys outside, who set out to pursue the perpetrators. After a few more seconds, Harrison is unable to avoid crashing his automobile into a ditch. When he and his pal try to flee, Chuck's guys catch up to them. They are taken to Chuck later, where he plans to punish them unless they can provide a satisfactory explanation. In contrast, Harrison doesn't offer an apology and instead criticizes Chuck for behaving like the country's leader. This infuriates the latter, and he promptly ties Harrison up to a metal pole. In the meanwhile, Adam returns to the wooded clearing where he first discovered Lana's body. He investigates and finds a headgear resembling one worn by Pat Creeker at previous baseball games. Since learning this, Adam has made up his mind to look into the matter more himself. Subsequently, he sneaks over to the Creeker house to examine the shoes stashed in the backyard. Those prints on the boots' heels are a dead ringer for the ones in the photo, which is a real shocker. Tracy then spots Adam and asks him what he's doing there, interrupting his attempt to do further research. Adam tells Ronnie he is only searching for him to buy drugs so he can get out of this jam. Wiley seemed to have a great time with Ronnie. He has a few beers and then attempts to make out with her, but Wiley is clearly not interested and she tells him so. Ronnie, however, refuses to give in and keeps pushing forward. Wiley wouldn't have had time to get away but for Tracy, who arrived just in time to whack him with a spade. Pat and Adam meet up later that night, and Pat explains to Adam that he didn't murder Lana, but rather tried to prevent her from doing something terrible. This explains the traces of conflict that were found close to the spot where she died. After leaving a letter for Adam, he walks away. At that very moment, Chuck and his guys arrived and opened fire on Pat. If Chuck were to go after the latter, Adam would step in and prevent him from getting away. He insists Pat is blameless, insisting that Lana is the one who did the unimaginable. Chuck is given the final note from his sister, which he claims Pat gave him earlier as proof of his story. Chuck is crushed by the news, and it only gets worse when he learns that Harrison, the youngster he tied to the pole earlier, has passed out. The young man is actually diabetic and is experiencing an insulin shock. Fortunately, bystanders who arrived on the scene were able to revive the youngster. Pat goes home and has a chat with Tracy, learning everything about her brother's previous antics. Angry and warning Ronnie not to repeat his actions, he scolds him. Wiley eventually comes up to Pat and begs him to let her off on the outskirts of town. But he declines, saying that Chuck and his henchmen are actively searching for him. After Adam finishes his conversation with one of his professors, the city's electricity is restored, sparking widespread celebration. Sadly, the 22-year-old educator begins to vomit blood and passes away immediately.